As tension continues to simmer in Ukraine's Crimea region, the chasm between the US and Russia appears to be widening. The US accuses Moscow of invading Ukraine and has issued some financial and travel sanctions on Russia. Russia has not acknowledged that it has deployed troops to the region, but the Kremlin has said that it has the right to use all means necessary to protect Russians in Ukraine. Joining me to discuss the eroding relationship between the United States and Russia is Times opinion writer Doyle McManus. Welcome, Doyle.
Hello, Ann. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. First of all, tell us, Doyle, how bad has this situation gotten? Are we indeed seeing the advent of a new Cold War?
Well, it's not quite as bad as the 50-year-long Cold War was. After all, we're not looking at two global alliances threatening each other with nuclear weapons just yet. But it is certainly the worst crisis between Russia and the West since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There's very little evidence of a compromise, or at least of an easy compromise solution coming out of the current talks. And in large part, that's because Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has staked what looks to be his honor, his reputation, his own ambitions on keeping Crimea as now a de facto possession of Russia, and maintaining a lot of influence, at least, over what goes on in the rest of Ukraine.
Well, expand on that a bit, please, Doyle. Why does Russia feel so threatened that Ukraine wants to join the EU? And shouldn't we understand that Russia would want to kind of solidify its sphere of influence?
Well, it is certainly understandable if you think about the long trajectory of Russian history, not just Soviet history, but Russian imperial history. Ukraine has been part of the Russian Empire for 300 years or more. Crimea, where the Russians have moved 20,000 or more troops, actually was part of Russia legally until 1954. It's not really thought of by most Russians as part of another country. It has many of the summer beach resorts that Russians have gone to for generations, including in the last 20 years. So yes, in that historical sense, but let's also take a look at Vladimir Putin himself. His ambition, his big agenda item as president of Russia has been to assemble what he calls a Eurasian economic union to counter the European Union in the West. It's not quite the Soviet Empire again, but it's pretty darn close. It is a sphere of influence. And as the revolution took hold in Ukraine and was in effect won by people who explicitly wanted to take Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence and get it closer to the EU, that wasn't just a historical challenge to Putin. It was a direct challenge to his main goal as president.
Well, obviously, this has not sat very well with the US and other Western nations. The US actually has threatened sanctions. What impact are sanctions likely to have, if any? I understand that Russian officials have said they're likely to backfire.
They have. The impact of sanctions is going to depend very much, not on what the United States says, because our direct economic relationship with Russia is fairly limited. It's going to depend on what the Europeans are willing to do, especially Germany. You have an enormous set of financial relationships, commercial relationships, and of course, Russia is the #1 supplier of natural gas to Western Europe. And so you have a great deal of intertwined economic relationships that would hurt both sides. At this point, both sides are really threatening to impose sanctions, and on the Russian side, threatening to impose return sanctions. That would be the backfire that they were speaking of. The actual sanctions that have been applied in practice are quite limited. They are really travel bans for some Russian officials, a warning to them that they probably won't get visas, some very, very limited freezes on assets, but the big stuff hasn't been done yet. The West, and I imagine the Russians, are hoping it never comes to that.
And how do you see this playing out, Doyle? Just lastly, is dialogue the answer? Are we likely to see any kind of military solution?
One big difference from the Cold War is no one is talking about military action between Russia and the West as being even a sensible option on the table. Usually, presidents of the United States and others say all options are on the table. That's a phrase you're not hearing this time because there is an option that's not really realistically on the table. That's direct military confrontation. So the question is, what can be achieved through pressure? What can be achieved through diplomacy? It was quite noteworthy over the weekend that Bob Gates, the former defense secretary, the former CIA head, a very realistic and tough-minded foreign policy thinker, said, in his view, Russia probably gets to keep Crimea, and the center of the argument now is whether Russia takes another step, moves any troops into eastern Ukraine, where there's a large Russian and Russian-speaking population, and what Russia does to try and exert more influence over the rest of Ukraine.
Well, very interesting. Thank you so much for your insight, Doyle.
My pleasure.
For more on this story and others, please visit latimes.com and follow us on Twitter @LATimes.